All right, Scott, should I start going through the intro? And I think more people will probably come in as we start.
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and start, and people can trickle in as we get going.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. This is a Hennepin University Partnership webinar. We've been doing these now with the pandemic going on, the virtual format. So thank you for joining us here. My name's Kenny. I'm a graduate assistant with the Hennepin University Partnership, and I'm joined here by the HUP director, Scott Vargo. And yeah, I just wanted to give a little welcome and also a little background of HUP in case any of you are unfamiliar with us. The Hennepin University Partnership is a strategic partnership between the University of Minnesota and Hennepin County. And we aim to connect these organizations at all points of mutual benefit with goals to catalyze research partnerships, engage students by providing experiences that enrich learning and build a future workforce, and to share expertise, best practices, and knowledge, academic, operational, and beyond, which is something that we hope will happen today as well. And if you wanted to see any of the other projects or events that HUP is putting on, please go to our website. And I just see a comment coming in. So I'll just explain the format that we're using for Zoom is the webinar format. So we're gonna have our presentation with Andrew Owen, and throughout you're welcome to submit questions. You can use the Q&A tab to do so. And then at the end, we're gonna have about 15 minutes to answer questions. And so if anything comes up, please submit, and we would love to answer those questions. So without further ado, I'm glad to welcome Andrew Owen today for this webinar. Andrew Owen is the director of the Accessibility Observatory at the University of Minnesota, which is the nation's leading resource for the research and application of accessibility-based transportation system evaluation. Andrew Owen is also a research fellow with the Center for Transportation Studies at the University of Minnesota. His work focuses on building and applying systems for collecting, calculating, analyzing, and communicating data describing transportation systems. And today, Andrew is going to give us an update on one of the national studies that's going on at the Accessibility Observatory. So thank you, Andrew, for joining us, and I will hand it over to you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Kenny. And thank you all for attending. Good afternoon. So as Kenny mentioned, the National Accessibility Evaluation, one of our large national projects, will be a particular focus of this. But I also want to talk about access and accessibility in some broader contexts as well, to talk about what access means, why it's important to measure it, what we have achieved through the National Accessibility Evaluation and what we're looking forward to in the coming years. And then I also want to shift from that national evaluation context to talk about how we are applying access at much more local levels, both here in the Twin Cities and in some other metro areas around the country. And then finally, because it's something that's topical and happening right now, I've got a quick update on access as it's handled by some draft federal legislation that's made its way out of the House and Senate Transportation Committees recently. I hope this will be interesting to you. I'm going to be saving hopefully a healthy chunk of time for questions at the end of the presentation. So if you do think of something as I'm going through this, please go ahead and capture it right then in the Q&A panel. And then once we get to the end, we'll go over those questions and address what we can. Again, thanks very much for joining us today. Make sure I know how to advance my slides here. There we go. As Kenny mentioned, the Accessibility Observatory that I direct is a research group within the University of Minnesota's Center for Transportation Studies, and we're focused on measuring access to destinations. That focus plays out in two broad ways. First of all, we look for opportunities to engage in research that will advance the tools and methods of how do we measure access to destinations. We want to be as precise as we can and produce data and results that are as meaningful and useful as possible. And then we also look for ways to apply those tools and methods that we develop to support improved transportation and land use planning, better understanding of transportation behavior and decision making. And we do this through sponsored research projects, through what we can think of as consulting services. We will often do small projects directly for agencies, or sometimes as a sub-consultant to a larger consulting organization that's really focused on the measurement rather than research and development. And then we also make some of our data sets primarily through the National Accessibility Evaluation Project. We'll make those public so that people can download them and learn from them, look at access in their local area without having to go through sponsoring a research project or anything like that. Before we jump into any of the details of these projects, I want to start at a pretty high level and talk just what is access and why is it important to measure. So access is a way of measuring the ease of reaching valued destinations. That's a very crafted definition that intentionally has some components in there that we can pick apart. Every trip, really every potential trip out there, when we think about all the different destinations that a traveler might travel to access, has a value, something at the end of the trip that is a motivation for doing it. Those are the benefits that we get from being able to reach a destination out there in the world. On the flip side, every trip has a cost, and often lots of different kinds of costs. So all travel takes some amount of time. Travel also costs money, depending on what mode you're using. You might have to pay a bus fare, or you might have to pay gas and maintenance for a car. Just the opportunity. If you spend time to one particular destination, you don't get to use that time to travel to other destinations. So all sorts of things that we give up in exchange for being able to reach a destination. Access is a way of combining those two concepts into single metrics that talk about what we might be able to get in exchange for get through travel in exchange for some sort of expense. And it's important to recognize that we're not looking at the past. What did people do? How many people traveled from this zone to this zone? How many trips were to get groceries, how many trips were to access work. That's all recorded behavior. It's actual travel that happened. Access is about measuring, in a sense, it's really about measuring the future, sometimes the very near-term future. We could talk about what things people are able to reach tomorrow, but it's all about opportunities and possibilities. Instead of asking me, for example, what my job is and where that work is performed, and then measuring how long it would take me to get there, access is about measuring all of the potential jobs that I could reach. So it's a much bigger picture sort of measure than behavior-based transportation data. And it takes a look at really what sort of stage is set every day that people go out and interact with. What could people reach, and how hard is it for them to reach those opportunities? Because access depends on or reflects both the costs and the benefits of travel, it's determined both by transportation and by land use. So on the transportation side, we invest in transportation networks and transit services in order to make it possible for people to move around. But of course, it happens at different speeds on different parts of the network and by different modes. And the exact structure of those networks and where people are on them determine how long it takes them to get from place to place. Access, though, is about much more than just travel times. It's about what could you reach in exchange for travel. So it also matters where all the things out there are in the world. If I live in a place where there are a lot of jobs very close to me, then I can reach a lot of them without having to travel at very high speeds or for very long. Conversely, if I live in a place where things are much more spread out, where destinations are further from me, then I either need to travel for longer or at higher speeds in order to reach them. And access reflects changes on both of those transportation and land use domains. It's also important to recognize that decisions in transportation and land use, like individual decisions, my choice of what mode I use to get to a destination, or if I'm looking to start up a business, what location I choose as a place to locate my business. Those decisions are made in response to accessibility. We often don't talk about this very explicitly, or it's something that it's kind of part of the conversation, but just below the surface. But when a business considers locations and talks about how easy will it be for customers to reach them, what they're talking about is access. A particular formulation that's focused on customers reaching a business they might be interested in, but that's a measurement and expression of access. Similarly, if I'm moving to a new city, I'm looking around for places to live, I might already have a job lined up and I'm looking for places that give me good access to that. Or maybe I'm looking for a job and I want to find a place where I know that any job I get would have a reasonable commute. I'm thinking about access. We often don't put it in these terms, but these are expressions of the same underlying fundamental concept. A few other important things about access. Access and accessibility are mode agnostic. We can talk about these same questions. How many jobs, how many grocery stores can I reach within 30 minutes by transit, by auto, by biking, by walking? That question means the same thing in all of those different modal contexts. That's not true of all transportation metrics. In fact, it's true perhaps of a minority of them. We have lots of ways of measuring transportation that focus on really technical aspects of individual modes. So congestion on highways is something that certainly interacts with performance of the transit network, but isn't really a measurement of the transit system itself. And similarly, on-time performance or system that's specific.
Can you rewind?
Loading.
Sorry, Andrew, you're having a little bit of connectivity.
Sure.
Can you go back just 15 seconds?
Yeah, I'll try to remember what I was saying 15 seconds ago. We're talking about the examples of transportation metrics that are specific to individual modes, like measuring highway congestion or on-time performance or vehicle loading for transit. They have to do really with the particularities of the road and highway mode or the transit mode of getting around. But access lets us measure the same thing across different transportation modes, which makes it a really valuable tool for understanding the differences between those modes and making comparisons between them, and also feeding into behavior questions. So we'll look at some examples of sort of what access is. Well, what does it look like if we undertake a measurement of this? We can map it out. This is data that's from our National Accessibility Evaluation Project. We've implemented these measurements for metro areas around the country. Here we're looking at a measurement of access to jobs by auto for the Twin Cities metropolitan area. So in this map, we've gone census block by census block. We pick up each of those blocks and treat it as an origin and ask, okay, within 30 minutes of driving, in the case of this map, how far can we reach? That lets us draw a 30-minute boundary around that origin. And then we say how many jobs are within that boundary. We add those up, we get a single number, and that's what's mapped on here. So every point is treated as an origin and then colored based on what can be reached from that location. And we can see that in the central core of the Twin Cities, people experience the highest access to jobs, being able to reach millions of jobs within 30 minutes by driving. And then as we move away from the center, that value generally decreases, though within the 494 or 694 ring, it tends to stay very high above many hundreds of thousands of jobs within 30 minutes. And we can see how the road and highway network kind of works to distribute that access throughout the surrounding area, with corridors of high access extending along major highway corridors. So we can see that this reflects both the location of jobs, largely, though not exclusively, centralized in the Twin Cities, as well as the structure of the regional road and highway network, and as it spreads along those networks out to places where people live. We can ask that exact same question, how many jobs can be reached within 30 minutes, for transit as well. And we get a really different picture. We see an evaluation of access where the peak is very much lower. Instead of millions of jobs within 30 minutes, a person using transit can reach a maximum of something like 250, 300,000 jobs within 30 minutes. And that's only from a few locations in the Twin Cities, clustered around downtown Minneapolis. We can also see how the patterns of how this access is distributed throughout the region are very different because it's distributed by a different network. The transit network functions very differently than the road and highway network. One of the biggest differences is that you can only enter it, you can only get onto a bus or a train at stops or stations. And so we'll see locations in the region where particular transit stations along the Blue Line, for example, show up as having really high access because you can get into the transit network there and then ride it to job centers. The Blue Line is particularly great at this because it'll get you to a job concentration in downtown Minneapolis as well as at the airport and the Mall of America. Again, we can ask the same question, how many jobs can be reached within 30 minutes for the biking network as well. When we implement access by biking, we try to bring a little bit more nuance than just what's the entire network, because there can be very different experiences biking on different parts of our road and bike trail network, depending on like the really specific physical configuration of, am I in a bike lane? Is there a painted buffer? How wide is the buffer? Is there a physical buffer? Am I on a trail completely off of the roadway? So when we implement measurements of access by bike, as much as possible, we try to incorporate a measurement of estimated user stress. We've adapted the level of traffic stress framework in and classify 1, 2, 3, or 4 levels of stress. In this evaluation here, we're looking at what we call medium stress. This is using parts of the network up to level 3. We would see a different map if we looked at access using only the lowest stress parts of the network, or access using the full network regardless of stress. And there's some interesting things to be learned comparing across and between access evaluations for different stress levels by bike. So access lets us talk about how easy it is to reach things out there in the world, but why measure it? Instead of just jumping in and throwing a bunch of resources out this, we want it to be based on, we're going to learn something useful and be able to apply this information to understand behavior or to guide decision making. Fortunately, there are some really great examples out there of research that ties access to specific important things in urban planning and travel behavior. This is not surprising, given that access tracks what we feel is a fundamental purpose of transportation. When we think about the motivation for, like, why do we buy new buses and assign them to schedules and drive them around, it's not because we want people to be able to see buses driving around, and it's not because we want people to be able to sit on buses for fun. It's because we believe that if we do that, people will have an easier time reaching destinations that are valuable to them. And often we don't know exactly what those destinations are. We don't base this on surveying every single person in the Twin Cities and learning exactly where they want to go and then providing a trip exactly to there. We provide much more generalized service, trusting that we've set up something that allows people to reach things that are important to them. Similarly, with roads and highways, we don't survey everyone, get an exact transportation demand budget from them, and then build them roads only to their destinations. We build a comprehensive network that, again, we trust is setting the stage for useful access in the future. So the purpose of transportation then can really be expressed as creating access, creating the potential to travel to destinations out there. And so because access measures that fundamental purpose, we expect that it'll be strongly associated with other metrics and ways that we measure the performance of our transportation and land use system. Measuring access also supports a long-term view of infrastructure and policy impacts. So when we're talking about a new highway interchange or upgrading a stretch of highway, that's an investment that is, it'll take a while even to come online, and then it's likely to be there and be operational and have a part to play in the regional network and access patterns for many decades. Similarly, decisions about transit service, because they influence access, they feed into decisions about where people want to locate, where businesses want to locate, and generate a reinforcing cycle that can last for a very, very long time. There are parts of the Twin Cities that grew up around streetcar networks, and those are the commercial nodes that developed in conjunction with those networks still exist many, many decades later after those decisions about network design were made. And then finally, measuring access allows us to connect sometimes very technical metrics attached to specific transportation modes like congestion or on-time performance, all those things about driving or transit or biking. We can connect those through access to questions about behavior, questions about equity, and questions about market dynamics. So for example, we're looking at some research that I was involved in a handful of years ago, connecting access with mode choice. Looking at census data on how likely residents in particular block groups were to choose transit versus choosing auto or driving to get to work. We found that with an increase of 100,000 in how many and this was able to explain about 2/3 of the variation.
Can you, I'm so sorry, can you start at the 100,000 increase? You were just saying that when you cut out the effect of that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks. I apologize for the interruption. Thanks very much for catching that. So in this research, we found that in a place, if we saw an increase of 100,000 in the number of jobs that could be reached within 50 minutes, residents of that location were almost twice as likely to commute to work using transit. So we saw a really strong and really significant correlation between how many jobs can be reached and how likely residents are to use transit to reach those jobs. We also saw that mode share depends on the variation in transit accessibility, not just the maximum or an average. So it's important to take into account like service frequency and a lot of other dynamic characteristics of the transportation network. So access can explain a lot of the variation in mode choice for commuting. On the sort of the other side of the mode choice question, we looked at the association of access and HOT lane subscriptions, min-pass lane subscriptions here in the Twin Cities, and found that access was a useful predictor of how likely a household is to subscribe to a min-pass program here in the Twin Cities or a similar program in other locations. A household that lives in a place whose access is improved by being able to use min-pass lanes is more likely to subscribe to that program. And we were able to map out very specifically where those access improvements exist and therefore understand the subscription patterns. Shifting into property values, researchers also at the University of Minnesota looking at home sale prices in Hennepin County found that with a 10% increase in jobs reachable within 30 minutes, we saw a 2.3% increase in home prices. And this is controlling for all the stuff you control for when looking at home prices, square footage and number of bathrooms and things like that. So we see a clear and significant correlation between how many jobs can be reached and the value of a residential property when it goes onto the market. And then finally, access gives us a way of understanding equity and how transportation investments impact equity. They allow us to ask really explicitly and get really detailed answers to who benefits from infrastructure and policies in transportation and land use. This study by Yingling Fan and others at the university looked at before and after the blue line came online for the first time, and mapped out access to jobs, but then differentiated it between low-wage workers and high-wage workers and what types of jobs they were able to reach, and found that workers across the board, everybody benefited from the line, low-wage workers included, but low-wage workers didn't benefit as much as high-wage workers did. This let us understand some of the resulting changes that we saw in travel behavior and access throughout the region as a result of the green line, the blue line coming online. So I'm going to shift gears from why access is important and what it's connected to looking at what we've been doing in the National Accessibility Evaluation. This project is implemented as it's called a pooled fund project. This is it's a funding mechanism that's organized by the Federal Highway Administration that lets DOTs pool research funds into a single research goal. And we've been lucky enough to work with 14 state DOTs, the Federal Highway Administration, and one MPO. And all of these are in this group of funders was initiated and is led by MnDOT, who sort of collects all that research motivation and then turns it into work with us at the university. The goals of this project and of doing it at this national scale are to establish a national access data source. We feel like this is something that really just should be out there. People who are curious about access should have a place to go where they can get this kind of data without having to develop their own custom analyses. To build capacity at our partners in this project, at those DOTs, build experience working with access data and concepts. We also feel that by doing this in a pooled fund approach, we can provide consistency and avoid redundant development of access metrics. If all 14 of these states were developing their own things, we'd see some waste there and people reinventing each other's work. And then also losing an opportunity to compare and contrast access results from different parts of the country, which we can do as long as they're measured consistently in different places. And then finally, we hope through this project to promote the use of access for performance management and for transportation and land use planning. Phase 1 of the National Accessibility Evaluation took place over roughly the past 5 years, and it produced access data and results covering 2014 through 2019, data for auto, for transit, for biking, and for walking. Those data sets were updated annually, building up a time series of access data that will let us learn about how access changed over those 5 years. And then we took that data and turned it into 14 reports in our Access Across America series. Those Access Across America reports are an interesting place to look for a really sort of big picture view of access trends around the country. One of the things we do in those reports is rankings of metro areas. And rankings summarized up at the metropolitan area level are always pretty coarse measurements. We're taking access measurements block by block and summarizing them up to multi-county areas. So we lose some of the detail. However, even looking at access at this really high view, there's an opportunity to see some important patterns and look at differences between metropolitan areas. So I want to first zoom in on the Twin Cities. The columns in this table, on the left, we've got just the total number of jobs, nothing about access, just how many jobs are there. And we've ranked the metro areas by total jobs. New York has the most jobs of any metro area and we go on down the list. The Twin Cities, just based on the total number of jobs I think this is based on 2018 data, ranked 14th. Okay. The rest of these columns are rankings based on access, average access for different modes. So the auto column is ranked based on how many jobs the average person in that metro area can reach by driving. The transit column is ranked by how many jobs the average person in that metro area can reach by transit. And we've got biking as well. One of the things we found is really interesting to do is to compare the ranks across these different modes. So if you can imagine a world where every metropolitan area did an equally good job of providing residents access to the jobs that they have by all modes, all of these columns would have the same ranking. The metro area with the 10th most jobs would also have the 10th most jobs reachable by driving and by transit and by biking. We don't live in that world. The world we live in, metro areas are wildly different in terms of how easy they make it to get around by different modes. And that's reflected in their ranking in terms of access by different modes. So we can look at the Twin Cities. And one of the things we notice looking across the entire region is that our access by any mode, by auto, by transit, by bike, our rank is higher than our rank by total employment. So that's a really positive sign for us, just in terms of long-term transportation and land use planning. It's easier to get to jobs by any mode in the Twin Cities than you'd predict just based on looking at the number of jobs that we have. People are able to reach more employment opportunities than you'd think, given how many jobs we have. That's really great. There are very few metro areas in the US that outperform their employment rank across all modes. But things get even more interesting when we look at some with other metro areas. So looking at Seattle, Seattle ranks 15th by total employment, just below the Twin Cities. In fact, we have a really similar level of total employment. First, tracking across modes for the Twin Cities, we do really, really well in access to jobs by auto, by driving. And we rank 6 slots higher than we do in total employment. For transit, we rank just 1 slot higher. And for biking, depending on whether you're talking about low or medium stress networks, we rank 2 or 6 slots higher. So these are all, good performance, but there's some variation across the modes. When we look at Seattle, again, roughly the same level of total employment, we see a really different pattern of those relative performance across modes. So looking at auto, Seattle actually ranks quite a bit worse in access by auto than it does in total employment. So 8 ranks lower, in fact, off the scale here, down at number 23. But for transit, it ranks 7 slots better than it does in total employment. And it's at about that same level for biking, both for low and medium stress networks. So comparing these two cities, or metro areas rather, Twin Cities and Seattle, we can see that Seattle has, through both transportation and land use policies, again, played out over decades, Seattle has relatively prioritized providing people jobs by transit and bike compared to the access that's provided by auto. The opposite is true in the Twin Cities, where we've had more success in providing people access to jobs by driving than we have providing access to jobs by transit or by biking. And that's all within the context of the Twin Cities still performing above average across all of these modes. So we've taken really detailed access data, summarized it up to the metropolitan area level, and we can see some really interesting trends played out across in terms of how policies in each location have prioritized access across different modes. All that's based on data from phase 1 of our national accessibility evaluation. We're right now in the first year of phase 2, which will provide data covering 2020 through 2024. During phase 2, we'll be continuing our annual data updates. We're going to be expanding to include new destination types. Phase 1 looked at access to jobs. We're starting to incorporate access to education and then access to healthcare, and then hopefully moving on to others based on what's supported by data sources out there. And then finally, phase 2 is an opportunity for us to expand our support of our partners with training for how to use access data, and then working with them on applications of access to performance management and to planning. To wrap up, we'll look at a couple examples of how access has been applied to those two areas of performance management and planning. Sort of a baseline level of use of access is to start tracking it as an official performance metric in annual reporting. We've seen several DOTs working with us begin to do this. The example here is from Florida DOT's annual performance management report, where they track access to jobs by auto and by transit at a statewide level. And then they also provide this data out to their planning districts as well as to MPOs for local tracking. And one thing we've heard from our DOT partners is that this kind of access tracking for performance management is a step in setting the stage for access goals. If eventually we want to say, we have a goal of improving access by 5% annually, we need to start by measuring it and tracking where it is to inform that kind of goal setting. We've also seen some of our partners connect access to existing performance metrics. Every state DOT, really perhaps every organization involved in transportation planning, looks at congestion in some form or another. Massachusetts DOT back in 2019 took a really deep dive into congestion in the Commonwealth. It became a pretty hot political topic. And one of the items that the DOT included in this report was a detailed look at how access to jobs is influenced by time in a location early in the morning when highways are still free flowing, and then access will start to drop off as the morning peak progresses and we see speeds decrease. We also had an opportunity locally to look at the influence that both transportation and land use have on job access. And we were able to map out in blue the location where a change in access was more influenced by changes in transit, and in red, locations where a change in access was more influenced by changes in employment and work locations. We can also look at a few examples of connecting access to planning. When we undertake these types of evaluations, we'll work with a partner in creating a scenario, a highway scenario, a transit scenario, and then we will map out the impact, the access impact of that scenario. So on the top here, we're looking at managed lanes in the Twin Cities. This is based on adding managed lanes on 494 in the South Metro, and then I-94, I-35W, and I-94 between Minneapolis and St. Paul. We add those managed lane segments, those min-pass segments to the network, and then we can map out what locations gain access and how much access as a result of having access to these new min-pass lanes. And with this audience, it's interesting to note that two of those new min-pass corridors included in this scenario are physically located within Hennepin County, I-94 North and 494. However, the areas with the largest benefits as a result of being able to access these new min-pass corridors are largely outside of Hennepin County. And it's a good reminder that because of the way networks work, the access beneficiaries of transportation investments are sometimes very far from the investment themselves. They might be in an entirely different place. And as another example, we worked with the Tampa Bay Regional Development Organization to look at the potential impact of new transit ways that are being planned in the Tampa Bay region. And again, we're able to map out in a detailed way where the benefits of those investments land. We're also able to look at the potential equity impacts of transportation investments. So here in the Twin Cities, this was some work that was done through the university's Transitway Impact Research Program that's partially funded by Hennepin County. We were able to look at the impact on access to different kinds of destinations, including education and healthcare, on different populations. So we're able to first map out the locations where access is improved as a result of the B, D, and E line transitways, and then take the next step to say, well, who lives in those locations and what demographic groups benefit the most from which of these lines and what kinds of access are improved for them. A final example I want to mention, and unfortunately, we still don't have a good illustration of this project. It was a very data-focused project. We worked with Cook County in Illinois. Some of you may be familiar with how they've made a lot of investments in converting rail corridors to really some pretty fantastic bike infrastructure that provide recreation opportunities, but also transportation given sometimes very long direct corridors. But they recognized that there were some neighborhoods that, though they were very close to these new bike trail facilities, they had very poor access to them because there weren't network connections, or it would have required biking through extremely busy, stressful intersections. So we worked with Cook County to evaluate low stress access to those major bike trails, identify locations that are experiencing barriers to them, places that are close but don't have good access, and then take their existing bike plans and evaluate them for how well they address those barriers and connected people with those bike facilities. The last item I wanted to touch on is just a quick look at access from the federal level. We zoomed all the way down to local implementations and evaluations of plans. This has been a really interesting year, though, to think recently relevant committees released draft legislation for transportation reauthorization, and the bills coming out of both the House and the Senate include to some degree a focus on measuring access to destinations. So we're seeing the potential that, you know, this is always a caveat of like, if something happens at all at the congressional level, we might see access being used as a national performance measure similar to congestion, potentially as a mandatory part of state and regional planning processes. So like the state transportation improvement plans might be required to show the access impact of elements of those plans. And we may also see access as a criteria for competitive federal grant programs. So like if we're applying for federal aid for local transit projects, it might become compulsory to show how access would change as a result of those projects. So this will be an interesting time politically for me, where things might go in different directions based on congressional action. So I'll wrap up just with some notes about if you're interested in working with access data yourself, a great place to start is to look at our public data sets that are available. We have some on our website. We are often frustratingly slow of updating our table of contents of data sets. So if there's additional detail or something missing you're interested in, you can always contact me or anybody on the Observatory team. We're also able to offer consulting services through external service agreements at the university so that we can do detailed measurement and evaluation for partners. And then we also have opportunities like through the TERP program to engage in sponsored research work. These are projects that typically involve new questions or developing new methods. So I'll wrap up right there. I want to make sure I have time to address questions that you have. Thanks very much for joining us today.
So thank you, Andrew. That was really interesting. And I'm sure people have questions. So if you do, please put them in the Q&A box or you can message them to the panelists in the chat feature if you'd like. And while people maybe think of questions, I have a couple of my own, if you don't mind fielding them. So you were talking about the different stress levels that you can use to calculate this job accessibility for biking. I was wondering, can you do things like that for different, like can you disaggregate transit data based on transit mode? So I'm thinking of like bus rapid transit, for example. Is that giving people a different amount of access than just a typical bus line versus a light rail?
Yeah. Yes, I think is the short answer to that. There's different ways to approach it. And we actually have had the opportunity to specifically to evaluate the transition of some local corridors from local bus service to our arterial BRT program. And we've been able to map out specifically the access benefits that come with the improved frequency and speed. It also does make it clear that in some cases there are trade-offs. Thinking of the conversion from the Route 5 to the, I believe that's the D line. I'm worried I'm going to get them mixed up. We saw cases where branches of those local routes were removed as part of the conversion to a much more direct ABRT trip. And so we saw individual blocks where sometimes access would decrease as a result of a longer walking trip to get to transit service. And then conversely, places very near that ABRT line, access would generally go up considerably as service that's already very close to you was improved.
That's cool. So the data can show the trade-offs as well. I think that's really valuable. We have a question that just came in, which is, what has your research shown regarding opportunity as it pertains to the Southwest Light Rail line?
Yeah. So one thing that can be said about transportation improvements is that it's, I was going to say it's impossible, but it's probably not impossible. It would be really
Andrew just cut out again. Sorry.
That's all right.
So you're just saying it would
be really hard. Yeah, it would be really hard to spend $1 billion on new transportation infrastructure and not improve access. And in fact, when we evaluate the Southwest corridor, we see really clear improvements of access all along that line, particularly concentrated at station locations. One of the things to keep in mind, though, is that those are measurements of access for locations. And a lot of the locations along that corridor are locations where currently we don't have significant amounts of housing or opportunities. That's not to say there's nothing there, but it's a lower density part of our region. And so that to some extent limits the access impact. Another way would be to put it would be to say that unlocking the full access benefit of that investment will take some really careful thought about zoning and what's allowed and what's encouraged to happen near those station locations, given that we've got this big transportation investment providing fast travel times. An approach seeking out the highest access possible would also involve encouraging pretty dramatic growth near those light rail station locations.
Well, I had another question, which is also about different, like multimodal transportation. I'm curious, so you looked at this relationship between MinPass subscriptions and job accessibility. I'm wondering if the relationship between job accessibility and some of these subscription-based shared mobility platforms, if that analysis exists. So I'm thinking of Nice Ride, Our Car, and kind of the other part of this question is, do these disrupt your research? Because a lot of these platforms are now getting much more mobile. So you can take a car, drive it to a different location, leave it there, somebody else can take it. And I feel like that's going to dramatically change where where you can get access to.
Yeah. So shared mobility, I would say shared mobility services or shared mobility programs are really interesting to look at in the access equation. They land in kind of a bunch of different places. To some extent, I think the access measurements that we've been doing can be applicable to them, but in some cases they'll each have kind of their own caveats about just how suitable they are. For example, like with ride-hailing cars, once you're in the car, you're just driving around like you are in your own car. But they add this waiting component to the beginning of the trip that's difficult to account for in access measures. You call a Lyft or an Uber, does it arrive in 2 minutes or does it arrive in 20 minutes? That's a really big difference in terms of overall travel time, but it's something that Uber and Lyft have all the information about. So we can say that the auto access data that we have is still applicable to that, but it's got this caveat of waiting time uncertainty added to it. So then with things like bike share or scooters, we've got bike access data that reflects a lot of detail about the network itself, but again, there are questions on the service provision side, like is it a dock full system or a dock less system, which actually makes it a little bit more like transit, where you can only get in or out of it at certain points. Like if you have to check in your bike at a dock, that's very different than if you can ride it all the way to the door of your destination and drop it off. So being able to apply those directly takes some understanding about the sort of technical differences between those different shared mobility services.
Absolutely. We just got another question, which is pertaining to ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we're wondering how does that factor into this analysis? And in particular, how is access availability for people with disabilities comparing with access availability for able-bodied people?
Yeah, so this is a great question.
Sorry, Andrew, can you just start from the beginning of your answer? Sorry, just
sure.
start.
This is a really good question. There's a lot of similarity between these different ways of talking about access. Fundamentally, we're asking, can people get to something that's important to them? And we can ask that same question for people with different physical abilities, with different financial abilities, and for different kinds of destinations. Applying these kinds of access metrics to the ADA definition of accessibility has been, I've been frustrated by how challenging it is to find opportunities to do that, for one. We also find that it's difficult to find data sources that will support us in that. For example, sidewalk condition and condition of pedestrian ramps and sidewalks is hugely important in terms of the walking component of transit trips. And yet it's really hard to get your hands on data about the condition of sidewalks or whether there's ramps at particular intersections or near transit stations. I've seen some work come out of Washington, DC, looking particularly at elevator versus escalator access in their metro stations, and people mapping out in a lot of detail how access is reduced if elevators go out of service and people who aren't able to use the escalators, then they have whole stations of the network that are inaccessible to them. That research was possible because WMATA, the local metro operator, maintains some really detailed data on elevator availability and where they're needed and whether there's alternatives or not. But in places where data like that doesn't exist, it's hard to support these sorts of analyses.
And we're getting kind of low on time, so maybe we have time for one more question. And I can give you one more, and maybe if you go through this quickly in case somebody else has a question, but it's not really a small question. We're wondering, How do you think this data is going to shift now that we have people commuting from home, basically virtual work? That must put kind of a wrench in the clarity of this sort of data.
Yeah, it definitely means that our access to job data is, I was going to say less applicable or less useful. I don't know if that's true. I'd say interpreting it is more complicated. It probably, like for someone who works at a restaurant somewhere, it means just the same thing that it always did. But for people in jobs like ours, Kenny, it looks like we're both sitting at home perhaps. It's a transformation, and it means that access to jobs by transit or by driving doesn't really apply to me in the same way that it did a few years ago. So I think that there's going to be a lot of thought going into the interpretation of existing data, and probably a lot more care going into who we apply it to, and like who we understand that it's guided by. So that said, though, looking at the job side of things, commuting is a minority of trip purposes. Like most travel that happens out there happens for a purpose other than getting to work. Commuting is the largest like single trip purpose, but most travel happens for some other reason. And there's plenty of people still traveling around out there. So I think this is a particularly lucky time for us to be expanding to talking about access to other kinds of destinations beyond work, where education, healthcare, just recreation and social activities, those are things that are going to involve travel really forever. Getting them into this sorts of data and finding information about the destinations themselves is going to be an interesting challenge.
Well, thank you so much for the great presentation and for answering questions. I put the link to the observatory or the Accessibility Observatory in the chat, so please visit and learn more and get engaged. And we put the data set link in there as well. And yes, Andrew, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Kenny, thanks for organizing this, and thank you all who attended, and thanks for your questions.
Thank you. And then for anyone, thanks again, Andrew. And then for anyone who is interested in following up with Andrew to learn more, Andrew, is it all right if we share your email address with folks? I'll take that as a yes. So we can connect afterwards.
Yes.
If you have questions for Andrew, you can reach out or contact HUP, and then we can put you in touch. Thank you, everyone.